this is a man who does a lot of like anti-colonial, anti-imperialist like type of like Twitter videos and YouTube videos and stuff, right? Wait, people believed his BS at one point? Who? Richard Medhurst or Nicholas Cruz? Which one? Is he a tanky? I have no clue. Anyway, one of my viewers sent me this video and wanted me to look at it. Because apparently, I already talked very briefly on stream about the Syrian elections and how they're fraudulent. But let's see if I can actually find all the results for all the elections in Syria for since the 1970s. See if I can find it quick. Because it's a good resource to show just how fraudulent these elections are. Can't scroll down. There we go. Now, where is it? Where is it? Where's the result? Here it is. Okay. So, before a single vote was cast, the West declared Syria's recent election to be undemocratic. Global governments have disputed the results, which saw Bashar al-Assad elected for a fourth term. Richard Medhurst asked the question, why is the will of the Syrian people being ignored? Posted by Russia Today.
Syrians have just re-elected Bashar al-Assad to be president for the fourth time. And the Western media has been calling it undemocratic because, as you know, any election that the CIA doesn't control is undemocratic. Right? The media talks about sham elections, but they can't even expand or elaborate what that even means.
Okay, so let's listen a little bit more. But if any of you have actually seen the results of this election, you would all know immediately this guy is smoking crack or something. I don't know why exactly he's saying this nonsense, but it's so obviously true that it was a sham.
They just bring on a bunch of bitter exiles and opposition figures.
Bitter exiles, people who were forced from their homes as their families were blown into smithereens, says the man who really cares about the Syrian people.
How can you talk about the elections in Syria and not mention the fact that most Syrians actually support Bashar al-Assad, that he won in a landslide victory with 76% turnout? Some people think you can only say these things when you are a big fan of Assad. The concept of...
Okay, so he's not going to talk about the security of Assad's elections. He's not going to talk about the history of the Ba'athist Party in Syria since the or democracy in Syria from the 1960s onward. He's not going to talk about the torture. He's not going to talk about the jailing of journalists. He's not going to talk about the history of elections. Sadly for him, I will. So let's start in the 1970s. Okay. Hafez al-Assad, 99.2% of the vote. Amazing result. I'm sure 99.2% of the population all decided at the same time that Hafez was the great man for the Ba'ath Party to lead the country. Oh, next year, 99.9. I guess a lot of them in this 7-year time span had decided that Hafez actually was the bee's knees. And literally, maybe a dozen or so people disagreed. And next year, it's the same results, 99.9 for Hafez. Next year, the same results, 99.9. Quite amazing. Next year, they somehow got the last dozen people to support Hafez al-Assad, with it getting 100% of the vote. Not a single Syrian, not a single man in all of Syria thinking that Hafez al-Assad was not good for them. I mean, we could talk about, like, the history of oppression of Kurdish peoples when it talks to the teaching of Kurdish language in schools. We can talk about how many were made stateless by terrible census policies. There was the surprise census of 1962. We could talk about the just general oppression that the Kurds faced. We could talk about the general oppression that generally people in Syria has faced. But no, not a single person, not a single Kurd, not a single Yazidi, not a single Arab, not a single Sunni, Shia, whoever. Not a single person thought Hafez al-Assad shouldn't be the leader of Syria. Then his son gets in, and I guess 0.3% disagreed with Bashar al-Assad. And from May in 2007, 99.82%. Now, in between the year 2000 and him getting 99.82%, which is actually an increase of the vote for him. In between that was the famous massacre at a Kurdish football field when Deir ez-Zor was playing against a primarily Kurdish football team backed by the locals, and dozens of unarmed Kurdish football fans were mowed down and tanks were set in to occupy Kurdish neighborhoods, who started burning down buildings and desecrating monuments to Hafez al-Assad, who had died recently after Bashar al-Assad took power. This was in 2004. It was a major event, and it showed that the Baath's party's stranglehold on power was not as strong as many people thought it was. But somehow, that historic event occurring increased Bashar al-Assad's percentage of the vote. And then he gets 92.20% and recently 95.1%. It's quite amazing, this turnout. All perfectly democratic. There's no way at all that there was anything else involved here. Nothing to be discussed about intimidation tactics, the history of torture, the jailing of journalists, the fact that much of the population has been bombed into smithereens. No. Instead of talking about this, or entertaining for a moment that there might be some undemocratic parts of Bashar al-Assad's government, he would rather pivot, saying, you're rejecting the will of the Syrian people in this totally democratic election. Because we all know that the Kurds, when getting mowed down, the Kurds love you the most when they're actively getting shot by your government.
Syrian sovereignty of respecting the will of the Syrians does not even enter their brains. You had Syria.
But the thing is, we don't believe it's the will of the Syrians. Is it the will of the Syrians who had their homes destroyed as they had to flee the country? Is it the will of the Syrians who openly rebelled against the government of Bashar al-Assad and joined the FSA? Is it the will of the Syrians who picked up guns and joined the SDF to repel ISIS because Bashar al-Assad couldn't do it himself? Is it the will of the Syrians who have been tortured by Bashar al-Assad's government? What about the will of the Syrians who were mowed down by his government when protesting against him? We're not even talking about 2011. I'm talking about 2004. I mean, when you say it's the will of the Syrians, number one, which Syrians? And number two, you really think it was 95.1%? That is almost as ridiculous as the first Assad as his father's 100% in the 1980s. That's ridiculous, and you know it. The Baath party doesn't have a democratic mandate. You can make a lot of arguments for Assad, and I've heard a lot of arguments for Assad, and it's usually along the lines of, well, you know, he's not a good cookie, the barrel bombs are bad, but he's much better than ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra and all these terrible organizations. And I can then talk about how he has not been the primary force fighting ISIS, and it was the SDF. We can have that discussion, but you have somehow tried to jump over that and say, no, this is about the will of the Syrian people. You can't pretend like it's the overwhelming will of the Syrian people to support Assad after the man just had to fight a civil war in his own country, mowed down unarmed protesters on multiple occasions, has a history of brutal torture tactics, was bombing the civilians in the smithereens. His own international backers, the Russians, bombed hospitals, killed civilians. I mean, the will of the Syrian people. I think the will of the Syrian people is to not get tortured. I mean, maybe that has some grounding. Mowing down protesters? Yes, Bashar al-Assad mowed down protesters. And the sad thing is, which occasion do you want me to show you? Do you want me to show you the football field or the city streets?
Syrians out celebrating in droves all over Syria. You don't think that's something you might want to mention? No, you don't think that's relevant to the topic?
Okay, wow, how can these people say that Trump was not democratically elected and it isn't a sham when I could show you this picture of a protest? Look, Trump obviously is the truly democratically elected leader of America, and my evidence picture of protest. Hell yeah. Wait, wait a second. You don't think that Pinochet was the true leader of Chile, picked by his people and supported by his people? Well, let me just show you some pro-Pinochet protests. Or, oh, you don't think Francisco Franco was supported by the people? Let me show you some Falangist protests. What is this bullshit? Yeah, I can show you a picture of a lot of protests. That means literally nothing. I can't. But what if we were going to talk about protests and showing pictures of protests? How about I show you the pictures again of protesters being mowed down? But those protesters don't matter to Richard Medhurst.
The media talks about Syrians suffering and living in poverty. Yeah, and why are they in poverty? Because Syria is under crippling sanctions imposed by the United States and the European Union.
That's the reason? That's the one and individual reason? That's the only reason. It didn't have to do with the fact that Bashar al-Assad was, and his backers were the primary force of destruction of Syrian infrastructure when it comes to bombing civilians. It doesn't have to at all do, and the slightest little bit, of Bashar al-Assad literally releasing terror. We can look this up. Bashar al-Assad releases terrorists. Four jihadists, one prison, all released by Assad and all now dead. Men freed from the same prison in 2011 went on to play senior roles in ISIS, al-Nusra, and other extremist groups. Why they were released and who later killed them are some of the key questions of Syria's brutal war. Look, there's a million reasons why Syrians are economically struggling, and I would say part of it probably is the sanctions. But you can't simplify it to that. You can't simplify it to that. Yes, sanctions 100% plays a part in the economy struggling. But you can't just say, oh, the reason why the economy of Syria is struggling is primarily sanctions. The first reason I would give is the fact that it's trying to recover from a brutal civil war that isn't even technically over. The FSA units supported by Turkey still exist. ISIS is still operating in Syria, in large part probably due to Donald Trump's withdrawal from northeastern Syria, giving them an ability to basically stopping pressure that the SDF was putting upon ISIS and anti-ISIS operations. They decreased by about 75% of the time from information from the Rojava Information Center. But then, of course, the SDF's territory, or the conflict between Turkey and the SDF, and Operation Peace Spring, and how that expanded the war. There's a million factors that came into play that created the situation we see now when it comes to the economy in Syria. Let's not simplify it. That's one factor, but let's not simplify it.
People are suffering because the West has been trying to destroy Syria for a decade.
Look, when you say destroy Syria for a decade, of course, we've taken policies that are contrary to the Syrian regime, and we have done things that are bad when it comes to Syria. But the thing that gets me is when we analyze the situation is to Richard Medhurst, Assad did nothing wrong. Or at least he doesn't want to mention Assad doing anything wrong. To Richard Medhurst, Assad is just a friendly little character that all the Syrians love. They love getting tortured. To Richard Medhurst, Syrian people just love having their fingers smashed. They love getting barrel bombed. They love being bombed by civilians, and Kurdish people love oppression. Maybe Richard Medhurst thinks they're genetically genetically they just like, who knows what Richard Medhurst believes on this issue. But it's just so strange to see no mention whatsoever from this guy when it comes to Bashar al-Assad's crimes and contributing to the current crisis. Because let me just say, there is a lot of people I could put this at the feet of. I could put this at the feet of Saudi Arabia and funny money into groups that are absolutely dreadful, that ended up, in my opinion, corrupting the FSA and destroying it from the inside and causing divisions. I could point to Qatar. I could point to Turkey and their backing of just disgusting organizations. I could point to the failure of what was the CIA operation? I have to Google it again. Of our CIA operation that did not that basically was a failure. I could point to the Russian government's bombing of Syrian hospitals and destructive policies towards the Syrian civilian population. I could even possibly point to some of our bombing that happened near Raqqa that was actually quite destructive. And you can make arguments about further accuracy being needed. We could make arguments, of course, about Bashar al-Assad's barrel bombs, or Bashar al-Assad releasing terrorists in 2011 during the protests, or the torture, or the fact that his leadership failed and led to Syrian civil war after mowing down protests. There's a million things we could talk about, but simplifying it as America did a bad and then Syria collapsed is ridiculous when the catalyst for the Syrian civil war were Syrians protesting. And then members of his own military, which of their own free will, left to join the rebellion. Does he think that the United States military has control of his own army? Ridiculous. I mean, you can say the CIA has done a lot of things, but control the Syrian Arab army, it did not.
There were no bread lines in Syria before the war. You didn't have to wait 48 hours up to 2 days just to get fuel. That's a direct result of Western intervention and the West trying to topple the Syrian government. They said that only people in government-controlled areas are allowed to vote, as if the government is purposely excluding people from voting. Why don't you go ask Al-Qaeda why they don't have polling stations in Idlib? Yeah, why don't you go ask the Americans who are stealing the oil in northeastern Syria why there are no polling stations?
Stealing the oil, as in because the Kurds don't have control of their own resources, because the Kurds are just lapdogs for the Syrian government, to Richard Medhurst. They don't deserve control of their own resources. The Kurds, who themselves, from Kobane to Raqqa to across all of northeastern Syria, who themselves lost thousands of people to push back ISIS, where the Syrian government failed and released terrorists who ended up joining ISIS and leading the slaughter and leading the enslavement of Yazidi girls. And you're gonna look me in the eye and say they don't have the right to control the resources they fought for? You fucking scumbag, you fucking rat-faced piece of shit, Richard Medhurst. I'm sorry. Fuck you. I don't even want to watch the rest of this thing. This guy pisses me off. I don't like him. What a piece of shit. Yeah, look at these election results, all Democratic. It's crazy that they've been able to keep it in the family for so long. This is so democracy. It's so democracy, I'm being overwhelmed. I mean, we all know Hafez al-Assad for being the democratic leader of a new generation. Dick Shithurst. Sorry. Oh, I really don't like him. God bless Bashar al-Assad, a much more humble man than his father.